My name is Harold. I'm 63 years old. On the evening of my daughter's engagement party, my son-in-law's mother leaned across the table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Honestly, Harold, did you have to come in your work clothes? You smell like a fish plant." I put my glass down slowly, felt the whole room go still, and said, "That's all right, I'll leave." But what I did next was not leave. Before we get into that, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know. I spent 38 years on the docks in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Commercial fisherman, then crew supervisor, then the man the younger guys called when a net fouled at 4 in the morning or a hydraulic line blew in weather that would make most people stay home. It is not glamorous work. It is cold and wet, and it smells like the sea and like effort, and I have never once been ashamed of it. That work put my daughter through university. That work paid off a house I own free and clear on a hill above the harbor. That work is who I am. My daughter Louise is 34. She has her mother's laugh and her grandmother's stubbornness and a heart so big it sometimes gets her into trouble. She teaches elementary school in Halifax now, which suits her down to the bone. She met her fiancé, Gareth, at a conference 2 years ago and called me that same night to tell me she thought she'd met someone worth keeping. I believed her. Gareth is a decent man, steady, kind to Louise in the quiet ways that actually matter. My issue was never Gareth. My issue was his mother, Vivienne. Vivienne Ashworth grew up in Westmount, Montreal, and never let you forget it. Her late husband ran an investment firm. She winters in Palm Beach now, sits on 3 charity boards, and speaks about wine the way some people speak about religion. She is not an unkind woman, exactly. She is something more particular than that. She is a woman who has decided that the world is divided into people with polish and people without it, and she has appointed herself the judge of which is which. From the first time I met her, at a dinner Gareth arranged at a restaurant in Halifax, I could see her taking inventory of me. The calluses on my hands, the way I held my fork, the fact that I ordered the halibut instead of the duck. She smiled at everything I said and agreed with none of it. I told myself I was imagining things. Louise squeezed my arm under the table in a way that told me I was not imagining things. The engagement party was held at Vivienne's home in the south end of Halifax. A big Victorian with freshly painted trim, and a caterer, and a woman who took your coat at the door. I drove up from Lunenburg that afternoon, stopped at the house to change, and got stuck 20 minutes behind a tractor on the highway. By the time I arrived, people were already into their second round of drinks. I had not had time to go home and shower again. I had worked the morning, and I smelled faintly of salt water and cold air. Not grease, not rot, just the honest smell of the Atlantic Ocean. Louise spotted me from across the room and came straight over, face bright, arms open. She hugged me hard and whispered, "I'm so glad you're here, Dad. That alone was worth the drive." I was standing near the windows talking to Garrett's uncle, a retired school teacher from Antigonish, who turned out to be excellent company, when Vivienne drifted over. She had a glass of white wine and an expression I had come to recognize, that particular blend of graciousness and judgment that she wore the way other women wear perfume. She looked at my jacket, a good wool blazer I had had for 15 years, then at my hands, then back up at my face. "Harold," she said, "it's lovely you could make it." The pause after "make it" lasted just long enough to carry a meaning. Then she leaned slightly toward me, dropping her voice as though she were doing me a favor. "Though honestly, did you have to come in your work clothes? You smell like a fish plant. My friends from the club are here tonight, and I do want the evening to feel a certain way." I put my glass down on the window ledge. Slow and deliberate, I heard the soft click it made against the wood. "That's all right," I said. "I'll leave." And I watched something flicker in her expression. Relief, I think. She had expected me to apologize. I did not apologize. Instead, I excused myself from the uncle from Antigonish, who had not heard the exchange, and shook my hand warmly, and I walked across the room to where Louise was standing with Gareth and 2 of her teacher friends. I touched her elbow and said quietly, "Can I have 2 minutes?" She read my face immediately and stepped aside. I told her what Vivienne had said, not with anger in my voice, just plainly, the way you relay a fact. Louise went very still. Gareth was watching us from 3 feet away, and I could see by his expression that this was not the first time his mother had done something like this. "Dad," Louise started. "I'm not leaving," I said, "and I'm not making a scene, but I need you to know what was said, and I need you to decide what you're going to do with it." She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked at Gareth. Something passed between them, the kind of communication you develop when you know a person well enough to speak without words. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. I went and found the uncle from Antigonish again, and we talked about the fishery and about the price of diesel and about a halibut he'd caught off a charter boat in 1987 that he still described as the greatest moment of his athletic life. He was generous with his laughter and his attention, and he smelled faintly of cedar and old pipe tobacco, which I found entirely acceptable. While we talked, I was aware of Louise moving through the room. I watched her, without appearing to watch her. She spoke to the caterer. She spoke to a woman I did not recognize near the kitchen doorway. She spoke quietly with Gareth for a long minute, his hand on her arm. Then she disappeared into the back of the house. 22 minutes later, she reappeared in the middle of the room and clinked a fork against her champagne glass. The room settled. "Before we go any further," Louise said, and her voice was steady and warm and carried the room easily the way a teacher's voice does, "I want to say something about family." Vivienne straightened slightly from her position near the fireplace. Gareth stood very still. "A lot of you know my dad," Louise said, and she gestured toward me. "He drove up from Lunenburg today. He got up at 5 this morning, the way he has gotten up at 5 every morning for 38 years, so that I could have piano lessons and a winter coat and a university education and every opportunity I've had. He is the most honest person I know. He is the hardest worker I know." She paused. "He smells a little bit like the ocean tonight because you worked this morning. I think that is something to be proud of." The room was quiet. A man I did not recognize, older, near the back, nodded slowly. One of Louise's teacher friends started clapping, and then a handful of others joined her. Vivienne's club friends stood very still in a cluster near the bookshelf, their expressions carefully arranged into neutrality. I felt something tighten in my chest. I am not a man who cries easily. My wife passed 8 years ago, and I cried then, and I have not cried much since. But standing in that room watching my daughter defend me in front of people who had decided I did not belong there, I came very close. Vivienne set her wineglass on the mantelpiece. Her face was composed, but her color was high. And then Louise said the second thing. "I'd also like to thank everyone who has already sent messages for tonight, including a few friends of the family." She pulled out her phone and read from the screen, "The Lunenburg Fishermen's Association, who sent flowers and a note that my father has been one of the most respected supervisors in the port community for 2 decades, and the principal of Sir Charles Tupper Elementary, who wanted Gareth and me to know that when Harold coached our school's reading program 3 winters ago, he was the first volunteer we'd had who brought homemade chowder for the whole staff every Friday." She looked up from the phone. "Just so everyone knows who's in the room." One of the women near the bookshelf, a friend of Vivienne's whose name I did not know, turned and looked at Vivienne with an expression that was not quite sympathy. Vivienne was looking at the carpet. It was not a loud moment. There was no dramatic confrontation. Louise had not raised her voice once. But the shape of the room had changed, and everyone in it knew it. Gareth crossed to me and shook my hand with both of his. "I'm sorry, Harold," he said quietly. "I should have said something months ago. I told him that the chance to say something was not gone, and that what mattered was what he did from here." He nodded. I believed him. Later, after the formal part of the evening had wound down and the caterers were clearing plates, Vivienne found me near the front hallway. I was getting my coat. She stood for a moment, as though she was sorting through several different things she might say and discarding most of them. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. She did not make it sound easy, but she made it sound genuine. What I said was unkind. It was also wrong. A pause. The things Louise said about you, I didn't know those things. You didn't ask, I said, not harshly, just honestly. She looked at me steadily. No, she said, I didn't. I put my coat on. Vivienne, I said, I'm not looking for a friendship. I'm looking for my daughter to be treated well by the family she's marrying into. That's all I need from you. She didn't argue. I think that surprised both of us. I drove back to Lunenburg that night, the highway dark and empty, the radio playing something old I half recognized. The harbor lights came into view just before midnight, and I sat in my truck for a minute in my own driveway before going inside. There is a photograph on my kitchen wall of my wife and Louise at the beach. Louise maybe 6 years old, both of them laughing at something out of frame. I looked at it for a long time. My wife would have handled that evening differently. She had a gift for saying the hard thing gently that I have never quite managed, but she raised a daughter who has it. That is not nothing. Louise called me the next morning before I was even off the dock. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was better than all right. She said she'd been thinking all night about whether she'd done the right thing, and I told her that she had done the only thing and that her mother would have agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I told Gareth that I want you at every family event from here on. Not as a guest, as my father, which means he's there, he's welcome, and nobody comments on what he smells like. She said Gareth had agreed without hesitation. I believe that too. The engagement party is 6 months behind us now. Louise and Gareth are married. The wedding was in August, on a clear Saturday on the harbor in Lunenburg. Vivienne came. She was perfectly civil. She sat at the table with the uncle from Antigonish, and by the end of dinner they were arguing cheerfully about whether Acadian French or Standard Quebecois is harder to understand, which I gathered was a compliment to both of them. She has not said anything unkind to me since. I do not know if that is growth or just strategy. I am willing to let time answer that question. What I know is this. I worked at docks for 38 years and I am not apologizing for it. The smell of salt water and diesel and cold air is the smell of a life spent doing honest work, the kind that builds things, the kind that holds communities together, the kind that quietly disappears when people like me are made to feel like an inconvenience at someone else's polished table. My wife knew that. My daughter knows that. And now Vivienne Ashworth knows it too. My father worked a pulp mill in Cape Breton for 30 years. He used to say that a man's worth is not in his appearance, but in whether he shows up. He meant that in every sense. Show up for your shift. Show up for your family. Show up when it is not comfortable or convenient or clean. I showed up. If you have a parrot who works with their hands, who smells like effort, who has never had certificates on the wall but has shown up every morning of your life, call them today. Not on the holiday when it is expected. Today, an ordinary Tuesday, just to say you see them. Those are the calls that last. The chairs they occupy are not replaceable. The hands that shaped you cannot be replicated. And the smell of honest work is not something to be ashamed of at any table, in any room, in any company. Call your parents. Tell them you see them. Do not wait until the chair is empty to say the things that matter most. I still think about that moment when I set my glass down on the window ledge, the soft click it made, how everything in me went very quiet. I have replayed it often enough to understand something that was not clear to me at the time. What Vivienne said to me that evening was not really about the smell. It was about a story she had already decided to tell herself, that some people belong at a certain kind of table and some people do not, and that the difference is visible in the clothes you wear and the work you do and the way your hands look. She had written me into that story before I ever walked through her door. The cruelty was almost incidental. What I did not do that night was argue with her version of things. I did not defend myself or make my case or list my credentials. I have learned, slowly, across 63 years of waking up early and doing what needed to be done, that the people who need to diminish you in order to feel elevated are not changed by argument. They are only changed, if they are changed at all, by evidence they cannot dismiss. Louise understood that. She did not confront her future mother-in-law with words. She let the room do it. She let 30 years of her father's life speak in a way that a single rebuttal never could have. That is a kind of intelligence I did not teach her directly. I taught her by example without knowing I was teaching anything. The chowder I brought to the school on Friday mornings, the hours at the dock, the way I showed up for things even when showing up was inconvenient. I was not calculating the lesson. I was just living the way my own father showed me. But it accumulated. It became something my daughter could point to when it mattered most. There is a thing I believe about how consequences actually work, not in any mystical sense, but in the plain, observable way that actions stack up over time. Vivian had spent years curating an identity built on surfaces, the right address, the right friends, the right table, and because she had built her worth on those surfaces, the moment someone showed that surfaces were not the measure, she had nothing left to stand behind. The room did not turn on her dramatically. It simply stopped confirming the story she had been telling. That is its own kind of accounting. For me, the accounting was different. 38 years of honest work, of being the person people called when things broke, of never asking for recognition because the work itself was sufficient. All of that came due that night in a Victorian sitting room in Halifax, in the form of a letter from a fishermen's association and a principal who remembered the chowder. I had not planned any of it. I had just kept showing up. I think about what it takes to raise a person like Louise. Not the logistics of it, the school fees and the winter coats, but the character underneath. She did not lose her composure. She did not become cruel. She stood up in a room full of people who had more money and more polish than she did, and she told the truth calmly and let the truth do the work. That takes something that cannot be purchased or inherited. It has to be built the same way you build anything that lasts. Slowly, honestly, under pressure, without shortcuts. I am not sure Vivienne is a different person now. I am not sure one evening is enough to undo a lifetime of looking down. But she has been civil. She has been present. She stayed at the wedding table and argued about French dialects with a retired schoolteacher from Antigonish and laughed genuinely at something he said. Maybe that is the beginning of something. Maybe it is just manners. Either way, I can work with it. What I know for certain is this. The life I built was not glamorous. It was cold and wet, and it smelled like salt water and diesel and effort. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.